Rhaenys Targaryen spent most of her life known as the Queen Who Never Was, and she obviously became the Queen Who Never Would or Could Be when she went into the first major dragon battle of the Dance of the Dragons and lost. But Rhaenys was ironically one of the most influential players in the dance, more for what she didn't do than what she did. And her character was one of the most interesting, if inconsistent, elements of House of the Dragon thus far. What has always made Rhaenys interesting within the context of the Targaryen civil war is that, if she or the people around her had decided, the Dance of the Dragons could have started a generation early. As the wife of a Valyrian and the daughter of a Baratheon, she theoretically was in a position of more power than Viserys. And even more interestingly, within the context of the dance, Rhaenys arguably had an equal legal claim to Viserys, and a much better legal claim than Rhaenyra herself. But some of the complexities of Rhaenys' situation were omitted from House of the Dragon, despite the fact that they make her character and the entire situation more interesting and meaningful within the context of what was to come. Because Rhaenys had the support of her husband, her mother, Jocelyn Baratheon, and her uncle, Borman Baratheon. But she also had Queen Alysanne, the wife of King Jaehaerys, who argued in favor of Rhaenys' inheritance and left her husband for 2 years when he passed over Rhaenys because she was female. And even though Jaehaerys and good Queen Alysanne eventually reunited, she went to her deathbed claiming that Rhaenys, Laena, and Laenor had been robbed of their inheritance rights. However, for Jaehaerys' part, he saw male primogeniture as firmly established precedent going all the way back to Aegon the Conqueror himself, who became the king despite the fact that his sister Visenya was older than him. When the matter was finally decided among the Great Council, Rhaenys and Laena were disqualified due to their gender, and it was Laenor's claim that posed the biggest challenge to Viserys's. That challenge, however, amounted to absolutely nothing, because Viserys was ultimately chosen, a choice that was largely attributed to the fact that he represented an unbroken male Targaryen bloodline. It is interesting, though, that the ambitious Rhaenys and Corlys accepted this decision without fighting for her inheritance, especially so once Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir. Yes, the danger of Daemon on the Iron Throne must have been evident to everyone, but it had literally already been decided that the inheritance rights of brothers come before daughters when Viserys' father Baelon was named heir over Rhaenys in the first place. And contrary to the belief of many of House of the Dragon's viewers, a lordship or kingship can't simply be bequeathed upon whoever the person currently in a position of power chooses, something that even Jaehaerys himself recognized. This, of course, makes Rhaenys an interesting, if confusing, character, because she and Corlys are both obviously ambitious in the book and in the series, and yet they don't choose to exploit this obvious period of instability for their own sakes, nor do they seemingly waver from that decision in the future, even when the safety of their families and their inheritances become further threatened by Rhaenyra's attempt to pass off the strong boys as legitimate. Ironically, when the Greens eventually took the throne for themselves, it was Rhaenys who first suggested going straight for dragon battle according to Fire and Blood. And Daemon, of all people, was the one who suggested that they wage war with words first. She is similarly described as flying into the fight over Rook's Rest pretty enthusiastically, despite the ultimately unfavorable outcome that ended the life of the Queen Who Never Was. Now, George R.R. Martin himself has structured Fire and Blood in a manner that allows for a lot of interpretive leeway. It is meant to be a historical accounting by in-universe characters who were not actually present for the events that they're chronicling, which clearly gives House of the Dragon a lot of flexibility when it comes to how they characterize the people that they're portraying. And that also makes Rhaenys an interesting character, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Taking some artistic liberties is to be expected whenever a written work is adapted for the screen. But the development of Rhaenys is particularly intriguing because she is in so many ways diametrically opposed to the character that she was explained to be in Fire and Blood. In fairness to the show, The Queen Who Never Was also seems to be a somewhat contradictory figure within the book as well, because she is largely described as an ambitious and aggressive person, which seems to come into conflict with the fact that she took a pass on her biggest opportunity for ambition and aggression by never fighting for her own claim to the Iron Throne when the opportunities presented themselves. But the Rhaenys that we see in House of the Dragon is arguably the most measured and cool-headed member of Team Black, and that is kind of a confusing choice for a multitude of reasons. Obviously, the fact that Fire and Blood described her so differently is relevant, but even within the context of the TV series, Rhaenys seemed to be inexplicably inconsistent in some really important ways. Becoming the Queen Who Never Was undoubtedly defined Rhaenys' character more than almost anything else, and her bitterness and resignation at being overlooked is palpable from the start of House of the Dragon. She expresses her doubts about a woman ever taking the Iron Throne to Rhaenyra, and Rhaenyra pretty brutally surmises that it was Rhaenys who was rejected, and that rejection won't apply to her. It's entirely possible that Rhaenys simply changed her mind over time and decided that Rhaenyra was worth supporting. But the fact that she is devoted enough to literally die for Rhaenyra's cause is baffling, even beyond their interpersonal conflict when Rhaenyra was young. House of the Dragon in general has a bit of an issue with accurately portraying some of the most important facets of the political situation and upheaval that the Dance of the Dragons represents. And Rhaenys' somewhat weird and inconsistent characterization is one of the most obvious instances of that problem. While it's certainly not beyond belief that she simply changed her mind and thought that a woman on the throne was not only possible, but worth fighting for, the role that Rhaenyra and Daemon personally play in her family makes her acceptance or even respect for them more than a little odd. Theoretically, one of the most plausible reasons for Rhaenys and Corlys not pursuing the throne for themselves or their children is that it would dangerously destabilize the realm. And the marriages between Baela, Jace, Rhaena, and Luke also theoretically represent their opportunity to get their own family on the Iron Throne anyway. But House of the Dragon has done a pretty poor job of conveying the massive risk that this also represents for everyone. Because sure, if Rhaenyra does win, she may possibly be able to put her children on the Iron Throne and the Driftwood Throne. But there is a near guarantee that those claims will also be challenged. And because the Strong Boys are actually illegitimate, there is a pretty solid chance that those who challenge them will be victorious. If that's how things actually transpire, then it would leave Rhaena and Baela in incredibly dire straits, because they are two women from two of the most powerful houses in Westeros, who could very believably wind up married to two illegitimate men, who will have absolutely nothing to inherit or even keep them safe with. Alicent, unsurprisingly, caught a lot of flack for refusing Rhaenyra's proposal to wed Jace and Helaena. But she likely did so because she, like anyone with eyes, recognizes this as a potentially huge problem and didn't want to tie Helaena down to a potentially sinking ship. But the fact that Corlys and especially Rhaenys don't have a similar issue with these betrothals, despite the fact that Rhaenys' entire life has literally been defined by her relationship to the powerful men around her, really doesn't make sense. However, there is another element of House of the Dragon's presentation of this entire Gordian knot of succession issues that is really confusing and once again portrays Rhaenys in a kind of strange light. Because yes, wedding Baela and Rhaena, her only true living heirs left, doesn't make sense. But it's also not something that would be up to Rhaenys, even though the series would make you think otherwise. Clearly, Rhaenys has played a massive part in raising Baela and Rhaena, but ultimately, Daemon is still their father, is still a Targaryen prince, and is still the one who would decide on his children's betrothals. The fact that House of the Dragon plays this storyline out as if it's a deal between Rhaenyra and Rhaenys, and a deal that Rhaenys gets the final decision on, is a really odd choice that makes Rhaenys' internal logic seem very inconsistent when there's no real reason behind that. In the same vein, Her commitment to Rhaenyra and Daemon's fight for the throne is confusing in a way that it really doesn't have to be. As it is, Rhaenys has very good reason to believe that Rhaenyra and Daemon played significant roles in the death of her own children, Laena and Laenor, so her devotion to their cause is unexpected and surprising. But there is also a very plausible explanation for that which House of the Dragon never really addresses. Because again, it makes Rhaenys look like the person who is ultimately in control of Baela and Rhaena when that's not true. Sure, it might not be as exciting or inspiring if Rhaenys sticks with the Blacks because they are in control of her granddaughters, rather than because of a staunch belief in their just cause. But it makes a lot more sense in the broader narrative and in the context of Rhaenys' characterization. It's obviously implied at different points of her character arc that Rhaenys has jumped onto the girl power train. But again, it's bizarre that House of the Dragon made this choice with her character specifically, given her personal history with Daemon and Rhaenyra. One of Rhaenys' fan-favorite scenes is unsurprisingly the moment where she drags Alicent for working in the service of men rather than taking power for herself, which clearly indicates that Rhaenys is supporting Rhaenyra because she wants to see a woman on the throne. But once again, her words seem to be contradictory to her actual characterization and the actual story in a multitude of ways. It's interesting that she challenges Alicent and asks if she never wanted the Iron Throne for herself, because Alicent has zero claim to the Iron Throne, while Rhaenys herself does. Alicent was also never in a position to fight for the Iron Throne, because she has no dragon, and would have had no support for any claim she tried to make. Which once again contrasts Rhaenys, who is a dragon rider and had considerable backing for her claim. There is actually some very interesting subtext to be explored here for Rhaenys as an individual, but the way that the show plays this interaction is a little baffling, because it seems to be entirely straightforward. There doesn't seem to be any intention behind the possibility that perhaps Rhaenys is projecting her own regrets onto Alicent. And it seems like the writers are genuinely trying to communicate to the audience that Alicent is supporting her son because she's a misogynist, and Rhaenyra is worth supporting because she's a woman. And herein lies what I think may have been the fundamental flaw with House of the Dragon's adaptation of Rhaenys. She actually comes across as a very wise and measured character when you don't scrutinize what she's saying or question whether or not it actually makes sense within the context of her personal narrative. And I think that's for a reason. I think that when the writers wanted to introduce certain ideas, perspectives, or statements into the story that they couldn't find an organic outlet for, they gave that material to Rhaenys. She always seems to enter the scene with the quote-unquote correct point of view, even if what she's saying contradicts her prior characterization, or even if it doesn't make sense within the context of her individual experience or the story at large. Another really obvious example of this is her reaction to Adam of Hull in Rhaenys' final episode. In contrast to her supposed negative feelings about even the idea of Corlys stepping out in fire and blood, she is not only not upset at seeing her husband's illegitimate son, but thinks that Corlys should be honoring him and raising him up rather than hiding him in the shadows. Obviously, from a purely moral standpoint, this is a very kind and admirable perspective for Rhaenys to have, and it's more than plausible that this point of view is a reflection of the writer's point of view. However, this magnanimity and generosity of spirit is an opinion that has political implications that the show actively ignores. House Velaryon is already in an incredibly shaky position and is on the verge of being usurped by bastards. And while both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon have refused to address this aspect of this fictional universe reasonably, elevating illegitimate children is actually genuinely a recipe for a potentially deadly succession crisis. The prejudice against bastards is obviously immoral from our modern perspective that has developed in a world where legitimacy has no real effect on anything. But there is a meaningful distinction between the negative stereotypes of bastard children in Westeros versus the genuine danger that illegitimate heirs can pose to entire families. So then, Rhaenys' attitude towards Adam is undeniably kind, but it also doesn't make sense within the context of the world she lives in or her own life experience. When Baela and Rhaena have been her primary concern for years, it's beyond bizarre for her to express support for her husband's illegitimate son, when his elevation would pose a very serious threat to the children she has loved and raised for all of their lives. More than perhaps any other character in House of the Dragon so far, Rhaenys Targaryen seemingly played the role of the Greek chorus, the character who is there to explain to us what we should be thinking, what we should be paying attention to, and where the storyline is probably going. That undeniably gave the Queen Who Never Was a gravitas and moral appeal that many of the other major players don't have, even if that somewhat comes at the expense of Rhaenys' internal consistency. Or, maybe Rhaenys Targaryen was simply meant to be a slightly inconsistent character. Real people are never one single thing over another, and it's certainly not unbelievable that Rhaenys could have just changed her mind over time or depending on the situation. But, if the series had been more cognizant of actually developing those changes on screen, or incorporating a deeper insight into why she did what she did, I think Rhaenys Targaryen would have been a better character for it. As it is, Rhaenys was a compelling character in both House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood, albeit for conflicting reasons. The Queen Who Never Was played the role of the fiery fighter in the book, and played the role of the sensible stalwart in the TV series. The internal logic of the Rhaenys Targaryen that we saw in House of the Dragon was sometimes questionable and sometimes confusing, but it's clear that the writers valued her personal point of view more than nearly any other supporting character, and chose to imbue her with the opinions and ideas that they themselves valued most within the story. But what do you think? What role was Rhaenys Targaryen really meant to serve in House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.